Hello, I'm Louis Meyers, and this is Meet the Author, where we're very pleased to welcome today from his home in Pennsylvania, Dr. David Oshinsky, who will be talking about his book, which was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for History, a book called Polio, An American Story. By way of introduction, Dr. Oshinsky is the director of the Division of Medical Humanities at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine. His many books include A Conspiracy So Immense, The World of Joe McCarthy, which was a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. He also wrote Worse Than Slavery, which won the Robert F. Kennedy Prize for its distinguished contribution in human rights, and then this book, which won the Pulitzer Prize. Bill Gates has written that Dr. Oshinsky's polio book, quote, influenced our decision to make polio eradication the top priority of the foundation, as well as my own personal priority. Dr. Oshinsky's most recent book is called Bellevue, 3 Centuries of Medicine and Mayhem at America's Most Storied Hospital. His articles and reviews appear regularly in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Review of Books, and other international publications. Dr. Oshinsky, welcome.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, this is, just by way of my own introduction, this is a book which is about medical and scientific breakthroughs, but it does not, you do not have to be a physician or a scientist to read it. You will learn a lot about the science that went behind the polio vaccine and was involved in the polio epidemic. But it also is, it's part mystery novel because they were searching for a way to combat the virus. It's also a personality study between some of the major players and researchers in this adventure over the course of some 30 years. And then finally, it has a look at public policy, how government and private industry came together to bring together a successful vaccine. So there's a lot in this book, and I would welcome anyone to begin it, because I think you're going to be hard-pressed to put it down. Let me just note also that the first recorded polio epidemic in the United States occurred here in Vermont, in the Otter Valley of Rutland, as you note in the book. But let me backstep a minute. As I ask a number of my authors, especially when it's a big book like this, what led you to want to research and write extensively about polio?
Well, I'm giving my age now. I am 81, and I was a child in the years before there was a polio vaccine. And these were years of extraordinary fear among parents in the United States. Polio is a paralytic disease. It can be a killer. It's also a disease that is a very visual disease. Indeed, you may go into a restaurant and not know who has a heart condition or who has cancer, but you did know who had polio. These were mainly children. They were in wheelchairs. They had leg braces and crutches, often in iron lungs, which we can talk about a little bit later. There was no prevention. There was no cure. And Louis, basically, polio is a summer disease. We're not 100% sure of why this is the case, but around every June, like clockwork, polio would descend on post-war America. This was in the late 1940s, early 50s. It had begun earlier, but it takes epidemic form after World War II. And I was a young child, and I can remember very, very vividly the fear of polio. I lived in New York City, excuse me, starting around June. The newspapers would have baseball box scores of the number of kids who were in polio units throughout the city. The number would grow in June, grow higher in July, still higher in August. And around Labor Day, when the cooler weather came, polio would basically be over for that season. You couldn't go to the movies as a child. They closed swimming pools. They basically tried to keep us apart. We had to nap for long periods of time. Everything a child didn't want to do was basically because of this disease. That's how I remember it. My parents remember it as a terror in which every week they would give me a polio test. Could I bring my chin to my chest? Could I touch my toes? And any form of stiffness or sore throat would bring me right to the doctor. It was quite extraordinary. My parents did not have much money, but we would go to the mountains every summer to avoid the virus. And in fact, you couldn't. The virus was everywhere. But the belief was that if you were in a crowded place like New York City, your risk was much, much higher.
In
And then I would,
context, I'm sorry. To put this in
I'm sorry.
context, you note that in 1900, infectious diseases had been the leading cause of death in the United States, but by 1950, this was no longer true. Now it was heart disease and cancer, and that had to do with
Right.
the onset of antibiotics available
Yes.
and whatnot. But here it
Also,
was. Here it was a
clean
new infectious
water.
disease that was
Yeah.
causing such disruption.
Yeah. Polio was different. We had sort of found there were very few vaccines at the time, but we had found a vaccine for smallpox, and that was pretty effective. There were a couple of others. There was one for rabies. There was one for diphtheria, but that was about it. And polio was sort of the new infectious disease on the block, made famous in the United States by Franklin Roosevelt. And we can talk about that a little bit later. But the one thing I did want to finish was that I would come back to school, the third grade in New York City, and you would see kids in wheelchairs, leg braces, and the occasional empty desk, meaning the child had not made it through the summer. And those are, I think, my strongest memories of the years before the first polio vaccine arrived.
There are some notable aspects to polio. One is, as you mentioned, it particularly hit children and young people. And the second notable aspect was that it tended, at least initially, to strike people who are well off, families that were economically well off, including Franklin D. Roosevelt, who came from a very wealthy family. Why was that?
We don't know. I can give you a sort of a very brief chronology of Roosevelt, and I think this holds pretty well. He was raised basically on an estate in the Hudson Valley. He had no contact with other children. He was taught by tutors and the like. And until he went to Harvard, or actually went to a prep school before, his life was fine. But once he was exposed to other children, his life became a medical encyclopedia. He got everything. He almost died in the great influenza of 1918 when he came down with double pneumonia. So I think that Roosevelt is a specific case of a person who goes out into the wider world basically with an immune system that is untested and runs into serious problems. As for the rest of us, there really is no good answer. The most likely scenario is that polio in the 1900s really takes epidemic form in the West, in countries like the United States, Western Europe, Australia, and the like. And we don't really know the reasons for this, but we assume that there had been a revolution in cleanliness, that people were starting to be very careful about washing their hands and having cleaner water and using all kinds of antiseptics to wipe things down. And it is very possible that because of that, young children were not exposed to poliovirus at a time when they had either maternal antibodies or basically the disease itself was less virulent. That is really the best answer we can give you. It had always been endemic, I'm sorry, for thousands of years in what we now call third world countries, in Africa and parts of Asia, Latin America. But it becomes epidemic in the 20th century only in the West. The United States is hit the hardest. And the belief is that polio may be a disease of cleanliness.
Well, as you write in your book, Franklin D. Roosevelt was extraordinarily important in the early on in the fight against polio. He was something of a national figure already. He would go on to become governor of New York and, of course, president for almost 16 years. But his disease drew attention, and he went down to Warm Springs, Georgia, where there was a small rehab facility, very rudimentary at the time. And with his money, his family money, and then with an organization, the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, that was formed, it began to attract huge amount of attention and funding. Can you talk a little bit about why he was so important in the whole story?
Sure. Roosevelt came down with polio in 1920. He was 39 years old. This was very rare for someone of that age to get polio. My feeling is, very, very briefly, yeah, that can you hear me okay, Louis? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, great. Roosevelt came down with polio in 1920. It was a very serious case. It almost killed him. And it took him out of the political arena for about 5 or 6 years, which in turn was a good thing because these were Republican years after World War I. And FDR, if he had run as a Democrat in New York, probably would not have won at that time. He comes back in 1928. He is fully paralyzed from the waist down. He also believes that polio is curable, not just preventable with a vaccine, but actually curable. And he will spend the rest of his life until his death in 1945 trying to find all kinds of cures. One was a water cure, which he did in Warm Springs, Georgia. They had certain springs there that he felt would rejuvenate him. The other were hot packs, moving muscles in some ways. Nothing worked. And to this day, nothing works. Once you get polio, you basically have polio. It might lessen a little bit, but you have it. But what Roosevelt tried to do in his belief that polio was curable was, as you mentioned, to set up this thing called the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. And it's interesting that polio at that time, being an infant disease, was called infantile paralysis. And what I think most of your viewers will understand is that they may not know the National Foundation, but they almost assuredly know the March of Dimes. The March of Dimes was the most important charity, I think, in the history of the United States. And it was begun by Franklin Roosevelt, who kind of put his law partner, Basil O'Connor, a New Englander, in charge. And basically, the March of Dimes revolutionized philanthropies, how you raise money. They were the first ones to use celebrities, for example, anyone from Marilyn Monroe to John Wayne to Richard Nixon. They also had these things called Mothers' Marches, very similar to what Susan Komen and cancer do today, where people like my parents would join the March of Dimes and on certain days during the year would go out and collect money. all school children were given these little cans and went around collecting dimes. Dimes were, no one was too poor to give a dime to help a kid walk again. And this is what happened. And by 1950, the March of Dimes was raising more money than every other American philanthropy put together, with the exception of the American Red Cross. And this was for a disease that had a finite number of children. It was, in terms of numbers, it was much smaller than childhood cancer or accidents or, excuse me, other things like that. But the March of Dimes had this extraordinary advertising bonanza, and they really were the first charity to work with Madison Avenue. I think most of your viewers, particularly after Mad Men, would know what Madison Avenue is. It was where advertising was done. These were the big firms, the advertising firms, excuse me, and the March of Dimes used them to great effect and became just a behemoth in terms of fundraising. And that has really kind of set the stage for how other charities and foundations today reach out to the public.
Now, you write in the book, going back to Warm Springs, Georgia. Well, first of all, I should note that Roosevelt had a sense of optimism about just about everything, or at least that's how he projected things. So it was not surprising that he would look at his own disease with a sense of optimism and energy. But you write about Warm Springs, Georgia, which was different in that it kind of reminds me of the Make-A-Wish Foundation or the things that Paul Newman has done, where these young people and children could come down here to Warm Springs, Georgia, receive a whole variety of treatments, but also some social support. So they were around other people who had polio, and they weren't being ostracized. And it seems like that was also perhaps the first time we've seen that in the United States, or one of the first times.
That's a very good point. Roosevelt loved going down there because it was the one place where he did not have to hide his disability. You see him in the pool, playing with children, throwing balls around. The water gave him a certain buoyancy, and he felt that, for that moment at least, he was cured. But you're absolutely right. He had an enormous sense of optimism that he would beat this and polio would be a thing of the past. It became a thing of the past, but not because of a cure, but because of the vaccines. And the March of Dimes was amazing. They were the ones who funded these vaccines, but they also promised that every child who had polio would be taken care of free of charge, whether that meant going down to Warm Springs or that meant being measured for all kinds of devices that made their life easier. It really was an amazing organization.
I mentioned at the start that this book is also about personalities, and there was a very strong personality, Basil O'Connor, you've mentioned, the New Englander, who was a law associate of sorts with Franklin Roosevelt early on, and then he becomes the head of the National Foundation, and is in that post for, decades, and has a huge impact. Can you talk a little bit about him, Basil O'Connor?
Sure. He was a New Englander with a strong New England accent, and he was FDR's law partner. And when FDR decided in the late 20s to go into politics again, that he felt he was well enough to basically go that route, he said to Basil O'Connor, I look at Warm Springs, I look at what has to be done, and I will use my celebrity in every way possible to get an organization going that will find the cure for polio and the prevention for polio. And he chose Basil O'Connor, and O'Connor was like a bulldog. I mean, there was no saying no to the man. And that was whether you were a researcher or whether you were a celebrity, or whether you ran the March of Dimes outlet in Dubuque, Iowa. He was on top of everything. He was relentless. And I think as an administrator, he is more, there is more about Basil O'Connor in terms of ending polio than I think anyone, with the exception of Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin.
Yeah, he was a tough guy. I think he was from Boston, or if I remember, but kind of a tough guy who you didn't want to cross because he was single-minded and also had the backing, of course, of the very popular President of the United States, which didn't hurt.
And
So,
his daughter had polio.
and I believe, did she die of polio? I can't recall. Yeah.
Yes.
So he lost a daughter to polio. So this was personal as well.
Yes.
So we move into the 1950s, and there we see the great battle, if you will, between Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin, the two of the major research figures in the discovery of the polio vaccine, and that's where really the second half of the book lies. Let's start with Jonas Salk, as you do in the book. Who was Jonas Salk? What was his background, and what was the approach he took to developing a vaccine?
Sure. Jonas Salk was born in New York City. He was the son of immigrants. And he went to the City College of New York, which is where the smartest kids in New York City who could not go to Ivy League colleges basically took their education. And what is interesting is that he then goes on to NYU Medical School, as does his rival Albert Sabin a few years later. And I think what is interesting is that the reason they chose NYU was that it was the only game in town. I'm sure, as you know, medical schools in the 1920s and 30s had what was called a Jewish quota. And Harvard and Yale and Penn and Cornell would just take very, very few Jewish students. And at that time, more than half of the applicants were Jewish. So basically, the great bulk of very, very good students had to go to NYU Medical School if they were from the East and they were Jewish, because that was the open door for them. Jonas Salk graduated in the 1930s. He immediately got a job as a researcher for a man named Tommy Francis at the University of Michigan, who is a brilliant virologist, and we'll hear his name later. And Salk became interested in what was known as a killed virus vaccine, and we still have some of them around today. A killed virus vaccine is a vaccine where you take live virus and you basically kill it using all kinds of chemicals, and you then juice it up with what are known as adjuvants. And what happens is that when you inject this killed virus into the body, it still has the power to stimulate the immune system, to alert the immune system that an invader has entered the body. Now, this was seen even by the 1950s as kind of the archaic way of doing it. There was another way of doing it, which Albert Sabin, another graduate of NYU Law School, and a really determined rival of Jonas Salk, which was a live virus vaccine. And a live virus vaccine is where you take the polio virus and you attenuate it very carefully to the point where it will provide strong immunity against polio without causing the disease, because it is live virus in your system. That was seen as the wave of the future. And you had two people, Salk working on his killed virus vaccine, Sabin on his live virus vaccine. And as you well know, Salk's killed virus vaccine had to be injected. It was basically done with needles. Sabin's vaccine was given on a sugar cube or in a little vial of liquid. And because polio is in fact begins in the gut, in the stomach, what you do is if you put live virus vaccine, it will go through the system and basically, hopefully, stimulate the immune system and prevent polio. These were two very different ways of doing it. And what is important to know is that the March of Dimes gave significant funding to both of these men and their laboratories. In other words, they took a chance on two rather than one.
This is,
Joe,
I'm
I'm
sorry.
sorry.
Well, I was going to say this is one of the other developments is they not only paid for the direct costs, but they paid for the indirect costs, which has been an issue recently in our federal funding at NIH and other places. But this was really important because the indirect funding was a substantial part of what made their lab work.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for bringing that up. So it's a really important point. Early in the 1940s, a brilliant researcher at Harvard named John Enders, who would be the only polio researcher to win a Nobel Prize. John Enders won a significant grant from the March of Dimes, and Harvard made him turn the grant down. And Enders said, "Well, why are you doing this?" And Harvard told him, it's nice you got this grant, but who's going to pay to light your lab? Who's going to pay to heat your lab? Who's going to pay for you to hire laboratory assistants and all the animals that you will need to test upon? We can't do this. So as you so rightly mentioned, what the March of Dimes did was to go back and to figure out indirect costs. In other words, we will not only give you the grant money, but we will give you a significant portion of what you need to indirectly make this grant go. And that, as you well know, became the lubricant that really finances academic medicine.
Yeah, Jonas Salk goes to the University of Pittsburgh ultimately after Michigan, where he basically builds it from scratch. Pittsburgh was sort of a backwater in medical and science, and after he arrived, that was no longer the case. He builds this ever-expanding lab and ever-expanding attention. I will note that viruses are probably more difficult to work with than bacteria. And at the time, we're talking the 40s and 50s, they did not have really electron microscopes, as far as I know, the kind we have now. So some of what they were doing is very labor intensive, very rudimentary. And you mentioned animals because I think they're maybe they don't get the credit they deserve, but it's kind of horrific. Thousands and thousands of monkeys were sacrificed over these years. They were using chimpanzees particularly and other forms of monkeys. That was a major part of the expense, was buying and housing and feeding and all these monkeys. It was also dangerous. I think at least one person in Salk's lab technician or researcher died after being bitten by a monkey who had a disease. So it was not safe, but certainly was not safe for the monkeys. And I question today whether thousands, at one point 17,000 monkeys were sacrificed. It probably wouldn't happen today.
That's with PETA and others, organizations and restrictions. I think you may well be correct. Tens of thousands of monkeys and chimpanzees were sacrificed. One reason being that their DNA and their makeup is as similar to humans as you can get. And monkey kidney tissue was also used to grow the polio virus. So monkeys, as you note, played an absolutely enormous role. And by 1954, Jonas Salk felt he was ready to test his vaccine.
So talk a little bit, I mentioned this is also a story about personalities, because, and you write extensively about the kind of person Salk was, and a little bit on his family life, and then Sabin. They were very different men. One gets a sense from your book that their different personalities, to some degree, affected the work they did, the work people who were working with them, and the progress they were able to make. So personality-wise, how would you describe each of them?
Jonas Salk was younger. He was very ambitious, as you noted. And he was kind of photogenic and willing to work with the March of Dimes as a spokesperson for what was happening. So he was always being trotted out as the white knight in a lab coat, and he became just tied to this disease and tied to the March of Dimes in ways that offended other researchers, particularly Albert Sabin, who was much more of a lab rat, wasn't that interested in publicizing his work. When it was done, it would be tested and it would work. And that's what he was all about. So you have Jonas Salk, who is younger, who is working on what is seen as an older, more traditional vaccine, and who was out in front of the cameras all the time. And then you have Albert Sabin, who has a much more prickly personality, and really resents Salk. The fact that he is playing to the public, the fact that Sabin believes he's got an inferior vaccine and yet he's going to come out first, because the vaccine was simply easier to make. And therefore, Sabin pretty much does everything he can to undermine the Salk vaccine as it's being developed, and then afterwards, after it comes out to the public. This was a very, very bitter competition. And I can understand the reasons why. I mean, science coming out first is vitally important. And having the kind of publicity machine on your side and being part of it gives you an enormous leg up with the public. And as we'll see maybe a little bit later in this program, it plays out in very nasty ways.
April 12th, 1955, speaking of publicity, Salk ends up on the cover of Time magazine. April 12th, 1955. Why is that date significant?
That is the date when the announcement comes down that the Salk vaccine is safe and potent and effective, and a national celebration is declared. What I'd like to do, if I could, would be just to go back a little bit to the Salk trials themselves. In 1954, the year before, Jonas Salk ran, and the March of Dimes really ran, the largest public health experiment in American history. It still is. It involved more than 1 million school children voluntarily. Half were given 3 shots of the real vaccine, and half were given 3 shots of a look-alike placebo. The study was double-blind, meaning that neither the kid getting the shot nor the person giving the shot knew whether it was the placebo or it was the real stuff. And because this was an era before computers, and you have over 1 million school children, the amount of paper was unbelievable. And it really took a full year to investigate this. And the man who led the investigation at the University of Michigan was Tommy Francis, who was Salk's mentor. Today, we may see that as a conflict of interest. But Tommy Francis was a wonderful scientist, honest as the day is long. Still, there are issues there, but the facts were that the vaccine was extremely effective with almost no side effects. And once that occurred, the nation went wild. And Salk became probably the most famous scientist, maybe with the exception of Albert Einstein, of that era and later eras as well. And as I say in the book, Jonas Salk was invited to the White House after 1950, in 1955, and Dwight Eisenhower, the five-star general, the hero of Normandy, actually broke down into tears as he thanked Jonas Salk for saving the children of the world. It's one of the great moments in American medicine.
Interesting, a little sidebar here. You mentioned a woman, I believe, Isabel Morgan, who was a top flight researcher, and really, you suggest may have been the first to discover the vaccine had she continued. There's echoes of the Rosalind Franklin
Yes, very much so.
history, but she doesn't really get pushed out as Rosalind Franklin did. Instead, she chooses to become married, and in that era, far fewer married women were working outside the home, and she becomes a homemaker and sort of gives up research for many years. In the meantime, of course, Salk and Sabin and others continue, but could have been potentially Isabel Morgan on the cover of Time magazine.
It could have been. We will never know. She, interestingly enough, was much more reluctant to take the final step, which was to test the vaccine on children. But by my count, she was about a year ahead of Jonas Salk in the race for a vaccine. And at the very height of her research power, she decided to get married. She made the choice that women had to make in those days, one or the other. And she basically never got back to researching polio. So it is the Salk vaccine as opposed to the Morgan vaccine.
So this massive trial is done. The results are very positive. The Salk vaccine gets approved for general use. And then a terrible situation arises called the Cutter incident, the Cutter episode. Can you talk about that?
Of course. Once the vaccine is basically seen to be working beautifully with very few side effects, every parent in America wants that vaccine for their child. We had a very, very small NIH, CDC, federal bureaucracy in health at this time, particularly when it came to looking at the safety of various medical products. To make a long story short, what the federal government did to try to, make sure that every parent now could have the vaccine was to give Salk's formula to 6 different vaccine makers. And one of them is Cutter Laboratories from Berkeley, California, on the West Coast. And Cutter is just really, they should not have been among the companies. They had no record in dealing with human vaccines. And to make a long story short, it turned out that they did not process properly, and there was a lot of live vaccine a lot of live virus in their vaccine. In other words, they had not filtered it and basically adulterated and actually killed it. It was there, live virus in the vaccines, and kids were given shots up and down the West Coast, and suddenly people are getting vaccine-induced polio. They're getting polio from taking the Cutter shot. And we're not talking about 2 or 3, we're talking about hundreds, and about a dozen died. And there were lots of paralytic cases. What is really interesting is that the CDC, small as it was, realized immediately there was some problem with Qatar on the West Coast, and they sent out investigators and very quickly found the problem, closed down Qatar, and for a short period of time, all polio vaccinations were stopped. And then once Qatar was taken off the market and the other vaccines were retested and seen as fine, they went back on the market within a matter of weeks. And what is most extraordinary is that it did not slow down the process of vaccination. Parents immediately lined their children up again. You have to realize no one knows, with great assurance, the vaccine is so young, it's so new. What's going to happen? It's been tested, that's good, but you're really taking a chance, and it gives you a sense of the difference between risk and reward in my parents' generation and risk and reward with parents today.
Well,
My parents understood, right?
it also gives the difference between back then when there were relatively few media outlets and now when the internet can spout out any number of different theories, factual or not. So
Absolutely.
But nevertheless, there is concern, and during this period of time, Sabin's live vaccine, which is actually much easier to administer because it's oral, comes to the fore. So where does it go from there in the 1960s and 70s? I mean, what was the last steps here?
Yeah, I'll just go back for a minute. Albert Sabin was ready to test his vaccine about a year or two after Salk's vaccine came out. The problem was that so many American children had been vaccinated with the Salk vaccine that Sabin couldn't test in the United States. So in one of the great Cold War stories of the 1950s, Sabin is invited to the Soviet Union, and the State Department says yes. And he goes over there and he administers his live virus oral vaccine to almost 80 million children. We're not talking about placebos. We're not talking about double blind. These kids are just lined up and they are given the vaccine. And Sabin comes back with fabulous numbers. In fact, the numbers were too good. The vaccine was potent. No one had any real side effects from it. And because Sabin was much more of a favorite in the vaccine community, and because, frankly, the Sabin vaccine is easier to give, Sabin pushed Salk and his vaccine right out of the picture. Salk had lowered the numbers of polio cases from about 50,000 a year down to about 1,500. Sabin in the 1960s, when his vaccine takes over, lowers those numbers to about a dozen a year. You go down from 50,000 to a dozen. And this is an enormous achievement. But as you know, it's an achievement with one black mark against it. And that is that in an infinitesimally small number of cases, the Sabin vaccine will revert to virulence, and the child taking it or a caregiver changing the child's diapers can come down with polio. And therefore, you can never get the number down to zero, because every year you will have a small number of polio cases that are vaccine induced.
Which is the reason why we have in developed countries around the world had returned to the inactivated or Salk vaccine.
That's correct.
The oral polio is still active. Polio is still used in countries like Pakistan, Nigeria, where it's difficult to just supply-wise and to administer shots.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And those are, so there are still small pockets, but the fact is that in most countries of the world, polio has been eradicated. I did want to mention
Right.
briefly the huge influence, you mentioned March of Dimes, but also of the Rotary. And I say that my father was Rotarian. I went to some of his lunch meetings when I was a kid and heard them talking about polio even then. The Rotary stepped up and made a huge difference.
I am so glad you brought that up, and congratulations to your father. Um, what happens is after the Sabin and Salk vaccines, the numbers go down to zero or close to zero in the United States. We haven't had a case of polio here in about 40 years. And the March of Dimes loses interest in polio, can't really raise money for it. And Rotary comes in the early 1980s and decides that ending polio worldwide, finding the last case of polio and ending it, will become its mission. And God bless them, they have done a simply phenomenal job in getting these numbers down to almost zero worldwide.
You also mentioned that this was probably the last major time that the government would not be as involved as it is now in most major studies, that because of the March of Dimes money that flooded in, much of that was done. And in fact, there was such a fear of socialized medicine, particularly among the AMA in the 1950s, that they were refusing government funding for these trials. They thought it was the first step towards socialized medicine. In the time we have left, there are a couple of broader issues that touch on our lives today. Obviously, we're in a big debate about immigration, and I think you note toward the end of the book that Jonas Salk, Albert Sabin, and Hilary Koprowski, who was another major researcher, were the children of Eastern European Jews. Basil O'Connor was the son of Irish migrants, and Thomas Francis, who you mentioned, Dr. Francis, came from a Welsh steelworking family. But you say all the more reason to note that the conquest of polio is truly an American story.
Yeah, and the reason I did that was for that reason, the things you have just mentioned. America has always been the place that accepts immigrants. And what happens over the years is that so many of these immigrants have turned out to be remarkable medical researchers. Polio is the perfect example. And without fresh blood, polio would not have been conquered in certainly my parents' lifetime, and perhaps not even today. You really needed fresh thinking. You needed young students who were relentlessly ambitious. And I think there is a message there. Obviously, we want to have safe borders. We want to make certain that we do this in the proper manner, but there is no doubting, in the case of polio, the fact that without the children of immigrants, this would have been a very different outcome.
Finally, thank you for that. And finally, in the last couple minutes we have here, we can't leave without talking a little bit about vaccine hesitancy and where vaccines stand in the public consciousness in America today. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of vaccine hesitancy around all sorts of vaccines, including polio. How does your story, I suppose someone could read your story both ways. They could say, yes, there is a real danger when you look at something like the Cutter episode, where children developed polio because of the vaccine. On the other hand, other people can say, look, you've eliminated polio from 50,000 to about 10 cases a year. So talk to us a little bit about what this story tells us about vaccines and what you would say to people with vaccine hesitancy.
Well, it's a very tricky story. I would say in terms of the Cutter incident, that it was an isolated incident, and that once the issue was solved, we have never had a problem with the Salk vaccine since. It works like a charm. There is no polio. And one of the problems we run into is that you have parents today who say, where is polio? Why should I vaccinate my child against anything that is not out there? It's, why take the chance? And of course, the answer is that if you stop vaccinating and you get below herd immunity, polio is only a plane ride away. The virus is still circulating in the world, and that means we have to keep vaccinating. And I think the best story in terms of this would be smallpox. Smallpox killed hundreds of millions of people over the centuries. And finally, in the late 1970s, the WHO and the Soviet Union, the United States got together and decided that they were going to basically eradicate that disease. And a major push was done throughout Asia and Africa. And smallpox is the only major human disease to be wiped from the face of the earth. It is no longer circulating. And because of that, we don't have to vaccinate. We haven't vaccinated against smallpox in almost 50 years. Think of how much money that has saved. Think of how many lives have been saved by the fact that there is no wild circulating smallpox virus. That is basically your best example. And we are on the cusp of doing the same thing with polio, although with the latest administration, I don't want to go too far down that road, but I worry about diseases like polio reoccurring in the United States.
Well, I am so grateful to you to be here. This has been a fascinating discussion. The book, as I've said, is so readable. It's all full of personality, full of life. You learn a lot about polio, but also even more about the history of American science in the past 50, 60 years. So, Dr. David Oshinsky, I want to thank you, and we'll look forward to reading more of your books and maybe looking back at some of your previous books. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I had a wonderful time. I really appreciate it.